Hi, thank you for joining us as we review the Protestant Reformation. We will begin today by taking a look at the Roman Catholic Church in Europe during the Middle Ages. The church dominated life in Europe. It was a center of religious and social life in a time when famine and hunger, disease like the Black Death, and invasion were routine. The church provided leadership in a very unstable time. And finally, the clergy were generally the only people who could read and write, and as a result, were often used by the kings to help administrate their kingdom. The church was simply the most powerful force in Europe. It was the largest landholder, owning 1/3 of all the land. Additionally, it was exceptionally wealthy, collecting a tithe of 1/10 of the income from both the nobility and the peasants. Power struggles between popes and kings were common occurrences. The pope, considering himself to be God's representative on earth, believed that he should be the final decision maker and who should be the next king in various kingdoms. The kings resented and resisted the Pope's attempt to stick his nose into what they considered their business. The church was very resistant to change, and that resistance leads to the Protestant Reformation, which leads in turn to the birth of new political and economic and social ideas and institutions. There are 4 causes of the Reformation: social, political, economic, and religious. Let's take a look at each of these in turn. Social causes of the Reformation stem from the Renaissance values of humanism, leading people to question the church and some of its practices. Northern humanists like Erasmus here argued that the church had lost its spiritual mission. It was more concerned with power and money than it was with saving souls. Additionally, the spread of the new printing press played a very large part in spreading the ideas and criticisms of the church. Political causes of the Reformation included the clashes between popes and kings that we mentioned earlier. In addition, the German and English nobility disliked the fact that the church was dominated by Italians. All of the popes at this point had come from Italy. The church itself was headquartered in Rome. Economic causes of the Reformation really stem from the church's immense wealth. Princes and kings were jealous of the wealth, and with merchants resented having to pay taxes to a church that was such a large landowner and so wealthy overall. And finally, we come to the religious causes of the Reformation. Critics said that the church and many of its leaders had become worldly and corrupt. Many people found the church's practices, such as the sale of indulgences, to be completely unacceptable. An indulgence was simply a pardon which released the sinner from performing penance or penalties for sins. In effect, the belief was that you were able to buy your way into heaven. And Northern humanists found that to be completely unacceptable. The Renaissance humanists believed that the church should change to an emphasis on personal faith and spirituality. The Catholic Church ignores these complaints. And now we come to one of the leading characters of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German monk who had been a law student before he entered the monastery, and he had particular issues with the sale of indulgences. In 1517, he challenges the church by posting his 95 theses or statements about indulgences on the cathedral door in Wittenberg. This, in effect, is similar to posting the statements on social media today. The expectation was people would read it and respond with their own comments and their own ideas. Thanks to the printing press, the ideas of Martin Luther spread rapidly through what is today Germany. There was actual open warfare between those who supported Martin Luther and those who continued to support the Roman Catholic Church. At one point, the Holy Roman Emperor declared Luther to be an outlaw, and banned the sale and distribution of Martin Luther's books and other writings. Martin Luther actually had to go into hiding, during which time he translated the Bible from Latin into German. Those who supported Martin Luther became known as Protestants because they were protesting against the church. To understand some of Martin Luther's beliefs, we need to first take a look at Roman Catholic practices in the Middle Ages. The church believed that salvation was attained by personal faith and by doing good works. The Pope was believed to be God's representative on earth, and as such was the final authority on all things religious as well as secular. The Bible and church services were both in Latin, and outside of the clergy, few people, if any, spoke Latin. As a result, they depended on the clergy to tell them what they should believe, what the Bible said, and how they should worship. In comparison, Martin Luther believed that salvation was attained by faith alone. Good works were not required. In addition, Martin Luther viewed the Bible to be the ultimate religious authority, not the Pope. And finally, Martin Luther's position was that all humans were equal before God. No individual, pope, bishop, whatever, stood before others. All humans were equal in God's eyes. Martin Luther's writings and teachings had awakened a deep desire of a great number of people who yearned for a simpler, much more personal religious experience. The next person we're interested in the Protestant Reformation is John Calvin. His beliefs become known as Calvinism. And anytime you hear the phrase Calvinism, you should associate that with the idea of predestination. We'll talk about predestination in just a minute. He also taught the importance of a strong work ethic, moral behavior, and thrift, and that leading a righteous life demonstrated a person's faith. Predestination is the idea that God long ago has determined who will go to heaven and who will go to hell. In other words, man's salvation is predetermined or predestined. The way the concept worked was, if you were destined to go to hell, it didn't matter what kind of life you led, no matter how good, your destiny would not change. On the other hand, if you were destined to go to heaven and you lived a bad life, you could still mess that up and not get to heaven. The problem was you didn't know which was your destiny. So it was in your best interest to lead a good, righteous life. Calvin's beliefs spread to France, Netherlands, and Scotland, and Calvinists in France were known as Huguenots, and as Protestants living in a strong majority of Catholics, they were often persecuted by the Catholic majority. In England, King Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church because the Pope would not grant him a divorce from his wife, who had not produced a male heir to the throne. Henry VIII heads up the National Church of England, grants himself the divorce, and then appropriates the lands and the wealth of the Catholic Church in England, keeping those proceeds for himself. Upon Henry's death, his daughter Mary returns the Catholic Church to England. Upon her death, Henry's other daughter Elizabeth restores the Anglican Church to England. It took some time, but eventually the Catholic Church grew concerned about the growing Protestant movement and the number of people who were leaving the faith. In response, the church mounted a series of reforms and worked to reassert its authority. The Society of Jesus was founded as a response to the Protestant Reformation. Its founder, Ignatius Loyola, shown here. The main objective was to spread Catholic doctrine around the world. Often referred to as the foot soldiers of the Catholic Reformation, Members of the society were known as Jesuits. Now, while the church did make reforms in places where it was badly needed, it did have a tendency to deal very harshly with those people who challenged their authority. The church introduced the Inquisition to root out and find sources of dissent and folks actively working against the church. In addition to the religious changes of the Protestant Reformation, both creation of Protestant denominations and reforms within the Catholic Church, the Reformation had some significant effects in other areas as well. One area was in an increased emphasis on education. If you were supposed to read the Bible yourself to form that personal relationship with God, you had to be able to read. As a result, time and effort and money were put into educating the general population rather than simply the clergy or the wealthy. In addition, with the increased use of the printing press, books became much more affordable and much more available. As a result, we see an increase in the literacy rate of the general population. And finally, John Calvin's teachings that financial success and success in business were signs of your destiny for salvation in the afterlife leads rise to what we call the Protestant work ethic. Hard work, good stewardship of money, and this leads to the economic system of capitalism which we enjoy in the United States today. We'll talk about capitalism in a future review session. Thank you for joining us today as we looked at the Protestant Reformation.